We are bringing you all the latest developments on the coronavirus pandemic around the world. Nearly 228,000 people have died. But let's start in South Korea, once one of the worst hit countries. It has recorded no new domestically transmitted cases for the first time since the outbreak peaked 2 months ago. In the US, the global epicenter of the pandemic, the top health advisor there says there have been positive results from an antiviral drug treating COVID-19. Economies across the European Union contracted by 3.5% in the first 3 months of this year. This is the steepest decline since the 2008 financial crisis. And Dave Grohl has thanked the BBC and all of the artists who took part in performing the band's song Times Like These to raise money for the fight against coronavirus. But it is not often we start the program with good news. South Korea, though, has some. They have recorded no new cases of coronavirus. That's after one of the toughest responses to the pandemic. Let's take you straight to Seoul. We can join the BBC's Laura Bicker, who is there for us. What a landmark moment, Laura. How did they do it?
It's lovely to be able to bring you this news. As a journalist who's followed this right from the start, I think even saying the word 0 cases means a lot. They really went after this virus. They were ready for this pandemic. They had a test prepared within a few days of the first confirmed case. They then set up a number of labs, 100 labs, to process those test results in a few hours. 600 test centres were set up across the country, including 80 drive-throughs. Anyone who thought they had the virus could have a test. So that was the testing, all ready to go. Then came the tracing element, the tracking element. They tried to track down anyone who could be potentially infected, and they used technology. Now, it's quite controversial, but they used CCTV, phone and bank records once someone was confirmed with the virus to map their movements. Those details were then sent as an emergency text alert to people who'd been in that area. It was a targeted text. It would tell you the information, where the patient had been, who they were, their name, their age, their occupation, and it gave you an idea if you might have been sitting next to them. That way you knew to isolate yourself and get a test. But it's this aggressive use of testing and tracing that appears to have got this outbreak under control.
And Laura, what about people's attitudes? Because presumably trust in government and trust in science is high.
I think one of the things that they did here that really made a difference was that they handed over all the daily briefings to the scientists. So we had 2 briefings a day, which sounds quite a lot, but every day the chief of the Korean Centre for Disease Control stood up in front of the cameras and answered questions for over an hour. Actually, yesterday she answered questions from children because it's been Children's Day. So it was that message. It came from the scientists, not the politicians. And I think that helped ensure the kind of feeling of transparency, the feeling that they were being told the information that they needed to hear. It's worth also pointing out that this country has never been in lockdown. Yes, it was part of a social distancing campaign. Yes, a number of places were closed, but restaurants, cafes have remained open. Businesses have been able to trade. It's kept the economy moving, even if it's been more sluggish than before. So that has also helped. It's also worth remembering that all of these measures have meant that fewer than 250 people have died. Now, I was in the worst hit region of Daegu 2 months ago. Ambulances were queuing out the door, and doctors were telling me then that they would get this under control. I have to admit, at the time, I was entirely sceptical, but they have kept their word. They have been utterly determined. And the testing, the tracing, and also the fact that they've managed to kind of make sure that anybody who's been infected has been isolated has ensured that they've got it under control, which has meant they can give one-to-one patient care. And that, they believe, means that fewer people have died.
Yeah, quite a moment for South Korea. Laura, good to have you with us. Laura Bicker there from Seoul. Germany being watched carefully around the world right now after beginning to ease some of its lockdown restrictions. Figures released earlier today show fewer new daily infections this week than last, and the crucial R value of the virus that indicates how many other people it's passed on to is below the danger threshold. More now from our correspondent Jenny Hill, who is in Berlin.
They've been looking at these figures very anxiously indeed. Announcing this morning, Angela Merkel's Chief of Staff, that the current restrictions will remain in place until May the 10th. I think few people will have been surprised by that, because Angela Merkel and the experts advising her have been saying that they needed a good 2 weeks to look to see whether there was any real impact on the infection figures from the easing of those restrictions, which, as you say, have been coming into force in a staggered way over the last couple of weeks. So it will be some time, the authorities say, until they can really actually tell whether there's a correlation between the figures we're seeing now and the impact of the restrictions being lifted. What I'd say, though, is that Angela Merkel has appeared very anxious ever since they announced those initial relaxations. She's going into that meeting today with the 16 state prime ministers. They will be discussing, for example, a template by which they can start to try and get more children back into school before the summer holidays begin. She's under a lot of pressure. Economically, the picture is absolutely dreadful here. Yesterday, her economy minister said that Germany is going into the worst recession since the Second World War. There are something like more than 10 million workers currently furloughed. It's not a pretty picture, and Angela Merkel's under a lot of pressure from the hospitality sector, because restaurants, bars and hotels still can't open. So she's trying to balance all of that up. But as her Chief of Staff said this morning, it's going to be a little while before the authorities can really assess whether the current relaxations have actually had any impact.
Well, the economic impact of the virus is beginning to show itself in official figures. Economies in the European Union contracted by an estimated 3.5% in the first 3 months of the year. It's the steepest decline since the financial crash in 2009 and comes with a rise in unemployment as well across the EU. Let's speak now to our economics correspondent, Andrew Walker. They make for grim reading, these figures. Andrew, just take us through them.
Yes, so for the Eurozone as a whole, we have a figure of 3.8% decline in the first quarter of this year compared with the end of last year. At this stage, we've only got a handful of countries that have put out some national figures, and 3 of them are big economies, which also make for pretty grim reading. France, it's 5.8%, Spain just a touch over 5%, and Italy just a touch below those kind of levels. And it's worth remembering this, that these figures are for the first quarter of the year, so they include 2 months, January and February, when there wasn't really very much going on by way of an economic impact of the health situation. So it's really only March where the figures are showing that impact. And that's leading most economists to take the view that, well, you know, these figures are dire, but we're going to see even worse for the second quarter of the year, because those will more fully reflect the extent of any shutdown. There might, of course, be some impact from the partial easing that might take place over the coming months, but it won't be enough to offset what will be another very bad figure for the period we are now in.
And Andrew, the European Central Bank are meeting today. What kind of levers can be pulled to help out Europe's economies?
Well, we've had a statement from the European Central Bank which indicated no change in their main interest rates, but they are doing a bit more by way of measures to ensure there's plenty of money sloshing around, if you like, the banking system. They're doing some very cheap loans to the banks that are specifically associated with the pandemic. The idea basically being to ensure that the financial system across the Eurozone doesn't get any kind of seizure as a result of people or businesses being worried that if they lend money, they might not be able to get it back. The ECB was already doing a lot by way of extremely low interest rates. One of its main rates is below 0. And by this program of quantitative easing going into the financial markets and buying financial assets with newly created money. That continues.
Andrew, thanks for joining us. Andrew Walker.